Hi everyone, this is Khan from Wrath of Minis, and today we're going to be, doing a painting video. Actually, it's going to be a bit of a post-mortem painting video of this Primaris Space Marine. I'm going to be painting it in the Dark Angels colors, and it's my first time ever painting a Dark Angels model, so it's sort of like a test model, really, trying to figure out the right colors and figuring out the right appropriate stuff. Okay, so now I'm going to be priming the model black. Generally, I'm going to utilize 3 or 4 drops of Vallejo black, and then I'm going to add a few drops of thinner, and then I'm going to mix that in with a very bad brush. Obviously, the objective here is just to make sure that we get the entire surface, all the nooks and crannies, and that we don't miss any part of it. And we can just do multiple passes, keeping it as smooth as we can until we get the appropriate, level of, coverage. Okay, in this bit, we're going to, after we've primed it, we're going to be doing a Zenithal lighting. We're going to be utilizing the Liquitex acrylic ink, which I find to be quite a good sort of medium in order to get the Zenithal light without having to use an additional primer. It kind of came out a little splotchy, which we're going to see in a moment. And so I would recommend maybe doing a droplet or 2 of thinner as well in the acrylic ink, and then you can fire it out that way. I also think that I had a bit of an issue with my compressor, and I had it at the wrong amount of PSI when I shot this out. So you can see that it's a little, splotchy in places. But again, with just Zenithal lighting, we're going to do sort of a top-down, from the zenith point shooting downwards. We're going to be catching general volumes and leaving the shadows generally in shadow. One of the things about the sort of white ink and the splotchiness of it is you really don't want to have that happen, because the next coat of paint that we're going to apply, that splotchiness will show up. And so we're going to have to put repeated coats down in order to remove it. So this is one of those things that I'm like, in hindsight, I would have absolutely had done better, or had made sure that the my Zenithal was just even more consistent in the process. Okay, so now I'm mixing some paint. I'm utilizing the Scale Color Artist 2 paint, so it's a sort of a heavy body, and you wouldn't want to put this directly into an airbrush. It would just immediately clog it properly. So at this point, I'm making sure that I'm getting the right consistency. I'm actually using the color Emerald Green, and then adding some thinner into it, making sure the right consistency, then putting it in the airbrush, and then firing it off. I use a piece of paper like that, the parchment from my wet palette, to make sure that it's firing appropriately. With that, I'm just going to lay down sort of the first sort of base coat and make sure I get the appropriate coverage. When I'm doing this, I tend to prefer to use a brighter color, or more of a mid-tone brighter color, because it's easier to apply shadows later on onto the model utilizing an airbrush. So I start with a bright, and then I will work my way backwards, and then maybe also work forward. And that's sort of like a thing that's a sort of like part step back and forth process about making sure that you get smooth blends. Now in this video, I probably didn't do quite as much of that, but I now know from more experience at this point in time that I'm like, okay, I know how I would better adjust to doing these things. Part of it comes down to when I utilizing a white Zenithal, then the best way to get the most pop is to go for a bright color on top of that white, and then you can utilize shadow colors to darken the recesses, making sure that you get shadows. So start with a bright, work into shadows, and if you really want to go for more additional highlights, then you would go and pick up a brighter color and fire onto the highest highlight spots. When I was painting this, I realized that I was like, how am I going to create my shadows? And I realized that what's interesting about complementary colors is that a complementary color, so green, and a complementary color is red, will actually give you a sort of neutral gray tone. And I was like, well, that's perfect. That's the kind of shadow color that I wanted to make, sort of maybe like grayish, purplish tone. And I thought, oh, that would be a neat way of using a complementary color. So you mix those two together and bang, create your shadows. All right, now we're off to our wet palette. So when I'm painting, especially like a brand new model that I've never painted before, and especially with like colors, not that colors I'm not accustomed to, but more about like a scheme or coming up with a new scheme, I don't always know up front what I'm going to be doing. You know, what are the shadows, what are the shades, and I just need to take a guess at it. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll put down a variety of different tones on my wet palette that I think I might be utilizing. So you can see here I've got about 6 different actually 7 different colors of green and sort of like a turquoise and a sort of gray tone, in which I'm thinking that I might just pick from and add to each other to create an appropriate mix and to see how I want to go about it. So I might not even utilize them. It's just a matter of having things at my disposal that I think I might be using. So after you've primed a model with your base colors and you've got the majority down, so you've got your shadows, you've got your highlights roughly, then it's time to really get into your highlighting or your edge highlighting side of things. So I'm really just picking out various elements to pick out so that they pop or that they start to differentiate each other. Because one of the key elements about painting any miniature is creating separation between like panels. I mean, Space Marines are great because they're generally like big flat surfaces with easy, straightforward volumes. So what we'll do is we'll need to make sure that we pick out the edges. So a lot of edge highlighting comes here. And so if you're going to be into edge highlighting, well then just make sure that you don't thin your paint out too much. You want to have a good amount of paint on your actual brush and just remove some of it either by twisting your brush or using a tissue paper and pulling off some of the paint. So I'm getting some black here, and I'm going to start filling in the recesses of the areas that should be black. There's like these areas that are like the joint sections for Space Marines, which should be darker than it. So I need to make sure that those are getting painted. You need to be careful, obviously, here. You don't want to do any damages to the colors that you've already started. And because we've also utilized an airbrush to get the main colors down, we actually do need to do a fair bit of defining so that the armor panels and various things do separate from each other. So there's something like panel liner, oil paints are all various choices at our disposal in which that we are going to help create that visual distinction from each other. And there you go. So there's a couple things about panel liner that I now know, which I didn't know back then, which is, so panel liner or oil paints has low, when you do like an oil wash, it has very low surface tension. Like it's something about a capillary effect in which that when you place it onto a surface, it kind of recesses immediately into the pulls into the recesses, which you can kind of see happening like right there. And it's great because it means that we create a black, dark, thin line between all of the various elements, which is what we want to do. Unfortunately, it's also spreading out away from the recesses. And this actually is a bit of a problem. So a way that we can make an adjustment for that is to utilize an airbrush and to prime the entire model or to varnish the model in a gloss varnish. When it's glossy, it actually makes the paint have a harder time adhering, which means that it keeps it much more to the recesses, which allows us to have a cleaner form of dark lining from all of the elements. So because I didn't do that in this, it actually made this paint job much, much harder. I actually had to work at it and go backwards effectively to cover up this sort of shiny effect that had happened and this darkening effect of an area I didn't want to have take place. So because of that, this took much longer than I would have originally planned for. I was hoping to do most of it via an airbrush and then really picking out the major highlights. But because of this element, I've had to go back and sort of fix those things. But that's okay, because painting is part of the process, and making mistakes means that for the future, I now know what to kind of avoid and what to look for as I go about doing it. So one of the things that you're dealing with when you're painting any model is, and it depends on how you like to work, but generally I'll start from darker colors and I'll work my way up to sort of my highlights, working in smaller and smaller places or spaces. So I've started with my sort of emerald green, shifted it around in like tonalities and things, and begin to build up more additional volumes with my brush, meaning that I'm starting to really pick and think about where light might be falling on the model and trying to create the appropriate volumes. So effectively, each time that I build up a new layer, I'm going to be adding maybe a bit of sort of this yellow, vanilla white color or vanilla yellow into it to sort of create more brightness into those areas. And sometimes if those bright areas become too bright or the transition is a bit too harsh, in my opinion, I will be doing some glazing. And if you don't know, glazing is a very straightforward thing. You just take it, it's mostly water with a little bit of pigment, and I will be using the brush in such a way to try and smoothen the transition between those bright or each of those layers that I've been creating. So right here, you can see that I'm just trying to cover up a little bit of the noise that I had created with the subsequent layer. And as I smoothen these things out, these gradients look relatively nice. And I keep doing that until sort of a bit by bit in different areas as I build up the entire model, trying to get the look that I'm thinking that I want. And that's kind of really what most of painting is. And as we build up these sort of higher highlights, things begin to appropriately pop. Now, so you have to be aware that our eyes, when we look at something, especially when it comes to miniature forms, we're obviously very interested in the face, but our eyes also naturally gravitate towards the brightest spots. So we're trying to make the face a bit brighter than other areas, maybe the shoulder pads, maybe just the chest area, and the rest of it doesn't matter too much. You can see that even like professional painters, that when they're painting like really like top quality stuff, sometimes they'll take a picture of their model, like when it's like a work in progress, and they won't even have painted the feet, and you won't even look at them. And you won't even look at them and think to yourself, wow, that's not actually been painted yet. You won't even think about it because it's really an unimportant part. So it's funny how our eyes or our mind work in that department. So I'm painting the chest piece right now, the wings plus the skull thing, and I've kind of gone for like an off-gray kind of bone-ish color. Just really, mixing my colors, thinking about starting with darker colors, and then just building subsequent layers of slightly brighter tones. At this point in time, because I've gotten to where it's close enough, I've added a little bit of additional white and trying to create that appropriate pop on the sort of emblem, picking out just little areas that I think where the light might be glinting or catching off those spaces. Okay, so now we're going to be painting some of the red. Firstly, I'm going to start with the eyes. Just pick out some of this. I got this Chimera red. Just to make sure you get the base coverage right. You're going to need to be pretty stable here because obviously eyes are quite small and can be a little tricky. So you want a sharp, good brush. Small is very helpful here. And just pick it out until you kind of get the appropriate coverage. Then I'm just taking a bit of white, making sure that it kind of becomes like a bit of a pink mix. And then I'm going to be picking out more of the details additionally on those eyes, kind of going further back rather than inward, just to make it seem like there's a little glint going on there. And if it goes too much in one way or another, I can always go back and glaze slightly over it to kind of cover things back up. With the sort of gun and his sword, or his chain sword, I kind of went for a similar tone as the shadow, but I went more red this time. So I'm utilizing the complementary color of green again, using some red, mixing them up until I get a sort of, darkish grayish purple, and trying to use that as my base color. And pretty much at that point in time, I'm just going to make sure I get all the, even coverage across everything, and then build up those subsequent layers with more additional red. And so that means eventually the red becomes a fair bit more vibrant, but I still want to make sure that I'm retaining the shadows of that grayish tone, because I'm trying to control more light, or being conscious of it. So I just want areas to be, I want to have nuance between all of those elements. So you can see here I've gone for a sort of a pink, and I'm hitting just this one area on the gun, almost as like has light would like glint off like an edge. That's kind of what I was going for there. So the rest of it's much darker, and that section is going to be where it's kind of brighter. This part we're going to be working on doing more of the silver. So when I start utilizing tones, I start to try and use the same. I try to use the same paint that I'm already have been using. So I'm going to take some greens. I'll probably add a little bit of black. I might even add a little bit of white, or even a tiny bit of yellow, mix them together and create my gray silvery tone. I'll start there getting my base colors down, and then I'm going to add subsequent more white. Now I pretend to not utilize white initially. What I'll do is I'll use a brighter tone, more like a yellow white or an ivory or an off-white at first, and then once I'm getting closer to my highest highlights, then I'll start to add white. Playing around with this is a sort of, everyone's a little different, because even if you go too brightly with something, or it's like the tones are too extreme, glazing is a way to bring back those colors to get an appropriate gradient. And so I tend to kind of mix between things. I'll do a layer or two here and there, and then I might do a tiny little glaze to make sure that things are just sort of being kind of coherent with each other and feel appropriate. You know, part of me is just like adding additional colors, you know, picking out all the little details, using the same tonality. So I've got some of the yellows that I might have used, or some of the browns that I used on some of the leather, adding them together and then creating a sort of a beige color, which allows me to create the parchment effect for his gun. And as you can see, all these sort of tiny little details, just picking them out, the model starts to look more like, you know, like a model. It looks properly painted. And we still have a bit to go, but we're getting there bit by bit. So once you get to this point where you've got most of the model pretty much done and where you want it to be, we kind of just start picking out really the highest highlighted areas. So I'm going to be using a off-white color, or picking out just minor details until I get to utilizing white. And at white, I'm only going to be utilizing it in just a few spots, in places that I just want that light to be seeming like it's reflecting or catching off the glint off some edge. And at this point in time, this is the last final moment before you can say, hey, you're done, and you can put that model away, never to be seen again. No, probably not, or you can use it to play. There are some things that I've learned over the process of having painted this in ways that I would do things differently. I'd be much more conscious about my airbrushing in the future. Also, I decided that I wanted to put decals on this model at the very end, and that I think is actually quite a bit of a mistake, or I didn't do it properly enough. And what I mean by this, I put the decals on, and then because the decals are very glossy, you actually need to do a really good job of, like, you need a gloss varnish, put the decals on, use like a solid ball so you like kind of melt away the plastic part of it so it looks cohesive. Otherwise, you've got these two very unique elements of like the decal or the transfer on the model, and you really want to hide that. So I kind of messed up, and I actually had to go back over the model, and which I don't show, and try and like cover up the edges and hide the difference between the decal and itself. So in future, I wouldn't have done that, or I would have done it at a much earlier phase and try to have actually I would have done it when I was doing the sort of the panel lining and making sure that section, I would have done it at the same sort of period of time. But again, you kind of, you know, you live and you learn at this point of time. So it's pretty much there. You know, seeing it backwards, I'm like, okay, it looks pretty cool. I'm quite happy with it. Sadly, I also don't have a video to show you guys of the final product. I actually sold this model before I decided to take this video of its final form. So I have a few photos which I took, which you're going to see shortly. But yeah, just sadly didn't get a chance to do so. Hopefully this video gives you a sense of the various steps that are involved to create your model to make it look as good as possible. I mean, up to wherever you want to go to it. And I know that like when you're trying something out for the very first time, that there's a bit of play. You have to give yourself this option, this chance to kind of get it wrong. And so me painting one marine, the next time I paint the same thing, I will be better prepared to paint the other Space Marine, or the next one of its color line. So it's always really worthwhile to paint one model, paint it well, see where all the things, all the various elements that you can like, oh, I can make an adjustment here and make an adjustment there. And as you do that, you get better and better and you can make those things. So as you can see here, this is the final element, the final shot. And I think that's the money shot right there. It looks really good to me. And I would be pretty happy to be playing with that model on the field. Obviously, I need to do its base, but it's too late. It has gone. So yeah, thank you guys very much for watching this video. Hopefully you enjoyed it and hopefully you've learned something useful from it.